Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Ice. Malcolm Lyons stood 6'3" with the kind of presence that made boardrooms fall silent. At 42, he had built an empire from nothing, a private security consulting firm that handled the dirtiest problems for the wealthiest clients. Politicians, celebrities, corporate executives, they all came to Malcolm when they needed someone disappeared from their lives, not literally, but close enough. His methods were legal, mostly, but always devastating. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw told part of his story. Military special operations, then private military contracting, and finally this, a business where his particular skills in psychological warfare and strategic destruction were worth millions. Malcolm didn't just ruin people. He dismantled them piece by piece, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge that they had brought it upon themselves. His marriage to Jennifer had been different, or so he'd thought. She was 28 when they met 5 years ago, a stunning brunette working as an interior designer for luxury homes. Jennifer Wilcox had seemed genuinely impressed by Malcolm's success rather than intimidated by his reputation. She laughed at his dark humor, listened to his war stories without flinching, and never asked him to change. Their wedding had been a small affair. Malcolm preferred privacy, and Jennifer had claimed she wanted intimacy over spectacle. Looking back now, Malcolm realized she simply hadn't wanted her family meeting his. The Lyons family had a reputation in certain circles, and not all of it was legal. Malcolm's cousin Eddie ran a high-end jewelry store in downtown Chicago, inherited from their grandfather who had built the business as a front for less savory activities back in the day. Eddie was legitimate now, but he understood the family code. Loyalty above all else, and betrayal meant consequences. The first sign of trouble had come 6 months ago when Jennifer started working late more frequently. Her interior design projects seemed to require an unusual amount of evening consultations and weekend site visits. Malcolm, who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by paying attention to details others missed, noticed everything. The new perfume she claimed was a gift from a grateful client. The way she turned her phone face down during dinner. The gym membership she never used but paid for religiously. But Malcolm was patient. In his line of work, you gathered intelligence before you acted. You built an airtight case before you pulled the trigger. Jennifer had no idea she was married to a man who could track a target across 3 continents and had once spent 8 months setting up a corrupt senator's downfall. A cheating wife will be child's play. The evening Jennifer announced she was going to a design conference in Milwaukee for the weekend, Malcolm made his first move. 20 minutes after she left, he was in her home office, going through her laptop with the kind of thoroughness that would have impressed his old CIA contacts. Password protection was a joke when you knew someone's patterns, and Jennifer was predictable. The emails told the story. 3 months of correspondence with someone named R. Green, starting professional and quickly becoming intimate. The messages were explicit enough to turn Malcolm's stomach, not from jealousy, but from disgust at the cheap, common nature of it all. This wasn't a passionate affair driven by some great love story. This was his wife playing house with another man, making a fool of Malcolm Lyons. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. Malcolm had been betrayed before by people he'd trusted with his life. The worst part was how ordinary it was. Jennifer wasn't some master manipulator or skilled deceiver. She was just another faithless wife who thought she was smarter than her husband. As Malcolm scrolled through 3 months of deleted messages he'd recovered, he began to smile. It wasn't a pleasant expression. People who had seen that smile before usually started looking for exits. Jennifer had no idea what she had awakened. Chapter 2. The players reveal themselves. Rhett Green was everything Malcolm had expected and somehow worse. Malcolm had spent the better part of a week surveilling Jennifer's lover, learning his routines, his weaknesses, his pathetic attempts at living above his station. At 35, Rhett worked as a sales manager at a luxury car dealership, the kind of man who wore expensive suits he couldn't quite afford and drove leased vehicles he pretended to own. More interesting was Rhett's background. Born Rhett Greenbaum in Detroit, he'd legally changed his name after a series of failed business ventures left him bankrupt at 28. He'd moved to Chicago with a carefully constructed new identity, telling people he'd inherited money from a deceased uncle. In reality, he'd been running small-time cons for years: credit card fraud, identity theft, romance scams targeting lonely divorcees. Malcolm discovered all of this within 48 hours. Rhett wasn't just stealing Malcolm's wife. He was planning to steal everything else. The emails Malcolm recovered painted a clear picture. Rhett had been studying Malcolm's business, his assets, his routines. Jennifer was feeding him information, access codes, account numbers. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning to clean him out. The revelation should have enraged Malcolm, but instead, it delighted him. This wasn't just about a cheating wife anymore. This was about two predators who had picked the wrong prey. Jennifer's pattern became clear once Malcolm knew what to look for. Her late nights coincided with Malcolm's business trips. Her design consultations happened at a downtown apartment Rhett was renting under a false name. Most damning of all, Jennifer had been photographing documents from Malcolm's home office, sending pictures of contracts, client lists, and financial statements to her lover. The apartment surveillance was almost too easy. Malcolm had been breaking into places and planting listening devices since he was 20 years old. Rhett's security consisted of a standard door lock and a building super who could be bribed with a $100 bill. Within 2 hours, Malcolm had eyes and ears on everything that happened in that sordid little love nest. What he heard made his blood run cold, not with anger, but with anticipation. "The safe is behind the painting in his office," Jennifer was saying, her voice breathy from whatever athletic activities had preceded this conversation. "The combination is our wedding date, but backwards. He thinks he's so clever. And you're sure he won't notice the account transfers?" Rhett's voice was nasal, weak. Malcolm had heard more authority from teenagers. "Malcolm travels every other week. I handle all the household finances anyway. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll be in Bermuda. I've been moving small amounts for months. He hasn't noticed a thing." Malcolm's smile grew wider as he listened. Jennifer had been stealing from him, photographing his classified client information and planning to disappear with both his money and his business secrets. In her mind, she was pulling off the perfect crime. In reality, she was handing Malcolm everything he needed to destroy both of their lives completely. But Malcolm wasn't just dealing with Jennifer and Rhett. As he dug deeper into their scheme, other players emerged. Jennifer's sister, Leslie Frazier, worked at the bank where Malcolm kept his business accounts. Phone records showed regular calls between the sisters, often right before Jennifer's visits to Rhett's apartment. Leslie was feeding insider information about Malcolm's financial activities. Even more interesting was Rhett's connection to Malcolm's business rival, Octavio Decker. Decker ran a competing security firm and had been trying to poach Malcolm's clients for years. Text messages recovered from Rhett's phone showed he'd been passing along information about Malcolm's contracts and methods. This wasn't just theft, it was industrial espionage. The web of betrayal spread further than Malcolm had initially realized, but that only made what was coming more satisfying. Jennifer thought she was playing checkers while Malcolm was orchestrating a chess match that would end with complete victory. The final piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source. Malcolm's longtime associate, Kenneth Barry, who handled discreet investigations for the firm, brought disturbing news about Jennifer's past. "Her first husband didn't die in a car accident like she told you," Kenneth said, sliding a thick folder across Malcolm's desk. "He died of poisoning, officially ruled accidental, bad seafood at a restaurant. But look at the insurance payout and the timeline." Malcolm studied the documents with the cold focus that had made him legendary in his field. Jennifer's first husband, a successful accountant named David Wilcox, had died just weeks after increasing his life insurance policy at his wife's suggestion. The restaurant where he allegedly consumed the tainted food had never had a single case of food poisoning before or since. "She's done this before," Malcolm said quietly. "Gets better," Kenneth continued. The restaurant was owned by a shell company. Guess who was listed as a consultant on the incorporation papers? Malcolm didn't need to guess. He could see Rhett Greenbaum's signature on the documents, dated 3 years before David Wilcox's convenient death. Jennifer wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a black widow and Malcolm was intended to be her next victim. But Jennifer had made one crucial error in judgment. She had chosen to prey on a man who had spent his entire adult life studying predators, learning their methods, and developing ways to turn their own weapons against them. Malcolm closed the folder and reached for his phone. It was time to set the trap. Chapter 3: The Ring That Started Everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Malcolm was reviewing security protocols for a Fortune 500 CEO who'd been receiving death threats. Eddie's voice on the other end was carefully controlled, but Malcolm could hear the underlying tension. "Cousin, I need you to come down to the store. We have a situation." Malcolm knew Eddie well enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. Eddie Lyons wasn't easily rattled. Growing up in their family had required a strong stomach and stronger nerves. For Eddie to call during business hours meant trouble. The jewelry store sat in Chicago's Gold Coast district, a gleaming testament to Eddie's legitimate success. 3 generations of Lyons had run precious metals through this location, though the nature of those metals hadn't always been entirely legal. Eddie had cleaned up the family business, but he understood the old codes. "Your wife is here," Eddie said the moment Malcolm walked through the door. "She's buying an engagement ring." Malcolm felt something cold settle in his chest. "It's not our anniversary." "No." Eddie's expression was grim. "She's with another guy. Just use your credit card to buy a ring for him." Through the one-way mirror that separated Eddie's office from the main showroom, Malcolm could see Jennifer and Rhett examining a 3-carat diamond ring. Jennifer was animated, excited, her hand already extended as if imagining how the ring would look. Rhett stood beside her with the smug expression of a man who thought he was getting away with something. But it was the casual intimacy between them that confirmed everything Malcolm had suspected. This wasn't a new affair driven by passion. They were comfortable together, familiar. They'd been planning this for a long time. "The ring's worth $35,000, Eddie continued. "Your credit card went through no problem. What do you want me to do?" Malcolm watched his wife of 5 years pick out an engagement ring for another man, using his money to celebrate her betrayal. A lesser man might have stormed into the showroom, might have confronted them both, might have made a scene. Malcolm was not a lesser man. "Approve the charge," Malcolm said calmly. "But switch the engraving." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "To what?" Malcolm's smile was razor-sharp. "Thank for the evidence, idiot." 24 hours later, Malcolm was in his home office when Jennifer's scream echoed through the house. The sound was primal, terrified, the cry of someone who had just realized they'd walked into a trap they couldn't escape. Jennifer burst through the office door, her face white as paper, the small velvet jewelry box trembling in her hands. "Why does this ring say, 'Thanks for the evidence, idiot'?" Malcolm looked up from his computer with the expression of mild curiosity he'd perfected over years of interrogating people who thought they were smarter than him. "I have no idea." "What ring?" "This ring." Jennifer thrust the box toward him. "The one from your credit card. The charge for $35,000. "My credit card?" Malcolm's performance was flawless, just the right amount of confusion mixed with growing concern. "Jennifer, I haven't bought any jewelry. Show me the statement." For a moment, Jennifer hesitated. She was beginning to realize that showing Malcolm the credit card statement would reveal more than she wanted to explain. But panic had overwhelmed her usual caution. The statement showed not just the jewelry purchase, but months of suspicious charges. Cash advances that Jennifer had been taking to fund her lifestyle with Rhett. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, clothing purchases that Malcolm had never seen her wear. A pattern of systematic theft that painted a clear picture of premeditated betrayal. "Jennifer," Malcolm said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that had once made enemy combatants confess secrets they'd sworn to take to their graves. "Would you like to explain why my credit card was used to buy an engagement ring that you apparently picked up personally?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Malcolm could see Jennifer's mind racing, trying to construct a lie that would explain the unexplainable. She was realizing, too late, that the engraving wasn't random. Someone knew. Someone had planned this. I can explain," she said finally. "I'm listening." But Jennifer had no explanation that would satisfy a man who already knew everything. as she stumbled through a series of increasingly desperate lies. The ring was for a client. She was holding it for a friend. There had been some mistake. Malcolm watched with the detached interest of an entomologist studying an insect. "You know what's interesting about evidence, Jennifer?" Malcolm said when she finally ran out of words. "Once you have it, everything else becomes just details to be worked out." Malcolm turned his computer screen toward her. On it was a single photograph. Jennifer and Rhett in bed together, taken through the window of Rhett's apartment 3 days earlier. It was explicit, damning, and unquestionably authentic. Jennifer's legs gave out. She sank into the chair across from Malcolm's desk, the engagement ring box falling from her numb fingers. "Malcolm, don't." The single word cut through her attempted explanation like a blade. "We're well past the point where your words have any value." Malcolm stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that would have been familiar to anyone who had served under his command. "Do you know what I do for a living, Jennifer?" "Really do." She nodded weakly. "Then you understand that when someone betrays me, when they steal from me, when they attempt to destroy everything I've built." Malcolm turned to face her, and Jennifer shrank back from the expression in his eyes. "I don't forgive. I don't forget. And I don't leave loose ends." The engagement ring sat between them on the desk, its engraving catching the light. "Thanks for the evidence, idiot. This ring isn't the end of your problems, Jennifer," Malcolm said softly. "It's the beginning of consequences you can't even imagine yet." Jennifer was crying now, makeup streaming down her face, but Malcolm felt nothing. No pity, no regret, no lingering affection for the woman he'd once thought he loved. There was only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had laid the perfect trap and watched his prey walk into it willingly. "Please," Jennifer whispered. "Can't we?" "No." Malcolm's voice was final. "We can't." Chapter 4. Unraveling the Web. 3 days after the ring incident, Malcolm sat in his private office reviewing the full scope of the conspiracy against him. What had started as a simple case of adultery had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Kenneth Barry's investigation had uncovered layers of betrayal that reached deep into Malcolm's business and personal life. The secure conference room in Malcolm's office building was soundproof and swept for electronic surveillance weekly. Kenneth spread files across the mahogany table like a detective presenting evidence to a jury. "It's worse than we initially thought," Kenneth began. "Jennifer's sister Leslie has been feeding bank information to Rhett for over a year. Every major transaction, every account transfer, every business deal, she's had access to all of it." Malcolm studied the bank records with growing interest rather than anger. The pattern was clear. Within hours of any significant financial activity in Malcolm's accounts, Rhett would receive detailed information via encrypted messages. But the truly damaging intelligence went beyond simple theft. "They've been selling information about your clients," Kenneth continued. "Look at this." The evidence was devastating. Client lists, security protocols, operational details for some of Malcolm's most sensitive contracts. All of it had been photographed and transmitted to Rhett, who was passing along to Malcolm's business rival, Octavio Decker. "Decker's been underbidding your contracts with inside information," Kenneth explained. "He knows your exact proposals, your security methodologies, your pricing structures. That's why you've been losing clients." Malcolm's security consulting firm had lost 3 major contracts in the past 6 months, each time to Decker's company with suspiciously similar proposals at slightly lower prices. Malcolm had attributed it to coincidence and aggressive competition. Now he understood it was industrial espionage orchestrated by his own wife. But the files revealed an even more sinister element. Jennifer hadn't just been stealing money and information. She'd been positioning Malcolm for complete destruction. "She's been building a case that you're mentally unstable," Kenneth said, sliding psychological evaluation forms across the table. "Look at these reports she's been filing with Dr. Marianne Carrillo." The documents were damning fabrications. Jennifer had been visiting a psychiatrist for months, claiming to be the victim of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation. According to her false testimony, Malcolm was paranoid, violent, and potentially dangerous to himself and others. "She's creating a paper trail," Malcolm realized. When I'm found dead, she'll claim I was suicidal and unstable. The insurance money, combined with what she's already stolen, would set her up for life. Gets worse, Kenneth continued. Rhett's real name is Rhett Greenbaum, and he has a history. 3 previous relationships with wealthy women, all of whom died under suspicious circumstances. He's not just a con man. He's a serial killer who specializes in making murder look like suicide or accident. Malcolm felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the same emotional detachment that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed him, she'd signed his death warrant. But she'd made one critical error. She'd chosen to target a man who had spent 20 years learning how to kill people creatively and get away with it. The investigation had also uncovered Jennifer's broader network of accomplices. Her sister Leslie was just the beginning. Jennifer's best friend, Tracy Idi0t, worked for the Illinois Department of Motor Vehicles and had been providing false identification documents. Another friend, Idi0t, was a nurse who had access to various untraceable drugs. They've been planning this for over 2 years, Kenneth concluded. Jennifer researched you extensively before you ever met. This wasn't romance. It was a targeted assassination disguised as marriage. Malcolm stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Chicago. 20 stories below, the city continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the war that was about to be declared in the shadows. What about Eddie? Malcolm asked. Your cousin's clean? He suspected something was wrong when Jennifer came in acting nervous, but he had no idea about the larger conspiracy. The engraving switch was brilliant, by the way. It forced her to reveal the credit card theft and gave us the opening we needed. Malcolm turned back to the evidence spread across the table. In military terms, this was intelligence gathering before a major offensive. Jennifer and her accomplices had declared war on him. They just didn't know the war had already begun. I want complete surveillance on all of them, Malcolm said. 24-hour coverage. I want to know every conversation, every meeting, every plan they make. And I want it all documented legally. Kenneth nodded. What about Rhett's apartment? You've been monitoring it for weeks. Maintain surveillance, but don't interfere. Let them think they're safe. Let them think I'm just a betrayed husband who's too shocked to think clearly. Malcolm's smile was predatory. Meanwhile, we're going to give them exactly what they want. Which is... Malcolm walked to his private safe and withdrew a thick folder labeled with his own name. They want me dead, and they want it to look like suicide. So we're going to let them think they're succeeding. Kenneth examined the contents of the folder with growing amazement. Malcolm had prepared documentation showing severe financial losses, forged psychiatric evaluations suggesting severe depression, and even what appeared to be suicide notes in his own handwriting. You've been planning this counter-operation since the beginning, Kenneth realized. I've been planning this since I was 12 years old and watched my father destroy the men who try to cheat him, Malcolm replied. The Lyons family doesn't forgive betrayal, Kenneth. We don't move on, we don't turn the other cheek, and we sure as hell don't let people get away with trying to murder us. Malcolm began laying out his strategy with the precision of a military campaign. Jennifer and her accomplices would be allowed to believe their plan was working. Malcolm would appear increasingly unstable, financially desperate, and emotionally broken. He would give them opportunities to accelerate their timeline, make them confident enough to attempt the final phase of their plan. And when they made their move, Malcolm would be ready with documentation of every crime they'd committed, every law they'd broken, and every person they'd involved in their conspiracy. This isn't just about revenge, Malcolm explained. This is about complete destruction. When I'm finished with them, they won't just be in prison. They'll be betrayed by every person they trusted, abandoned by every ally they thought they had, and left with nothing but the knowledge that they brought it all on themselves. Kenneth nodded slowly. He'd worked with Malcolm long enough to know that when his boss made that particular expression, someone was about to learn a very hard lesson about choosing the wrong enemy. What do you want to start? Malcolm's answer was simple. We're going to let Jennifer think she's winning. Chapter 5. The Art of Deception. Malcolm's performance over the next 3 weeks was worthy of awards he would never receive. To Jennifer and her conspirators, He appeared to be a man slowly cracking under the pressure of betrayal and business failures. He started drinking more visibly, leaving empty bottles where Jennifer would find them. He began taking calls in front of her from imaginary creditors, growing increasingly agitated about fictional financial problems. The beauty of the deception was that Jennifer wanted to believe Malcolm was falling apart. Every sign of weakness she observed confirmed her narrative and encouraged her to accelerate the timeline for his destruction. Malcolm's apparent deterioration coincided with carefully orchestrated business setbacks. Using his network of contacts, Malcolm arranged for several high-profile clients to publicly terminate their contracts, citing concerns about his company's security protocols. To outside observers, it appeared that Malcolm's firm was imploding due to incompetence. In reality, each lost client was part of the elaborate trap being constructed around Jennifer and her accomplices. "He's losing it completely," Jennifer confided to Rhett during one of their apartment meetings, unaware that Malcolm was listening to every word through the surveillance equipment he'd installed. "Yesterday, he threw a glass against the wall and started screaming about people trying to destroy him. The paranoia is getting worse." Rhett's response was telling. "Good. The more unstable he appears, the more believable it'll be when we make our move. How are the financial accounts looking?" "Better than expected. I've moved almost $200,000 into the offshore accounts without him noticing. Between that and the insurance money, we'll have enough to disappear permanently." Malcolm's smile was cold as he listened from his real office, the one Jennifer didn't know existed in a building across town. Every financial transaction she mentioned was being documented by Kenneth's team. Every theft, every fraudulent transfer, every piece of evidence that would ensure her complete destruction when the time came. But Malcolm wasn't content to simply catch them in the act of theft. Jennifer had tried to have him killed, and that required a response proportional to the crime. Malcolm began implementing psychological warfare tactics that would have impressed his old military instructors. The first phase involved making Jennifer doubt her own perceptions. Malcolm arranged for people from her past to contact her unexpectedly. Former coworkers who mentioned seeing her in places she'd never been, college friends who referenced conversations that had never happened. The goal was to make Jennifer question her own memory and judgment, classic gaslighting techniques that Malcolm had learned from interrogating enemy agents. Simultaneously, Malcolm began feeding false information through channels he knew Jennifer was monitoring. He planted documents suggesting he was planning to transfer large sums of money to overseas accounts, implying that he was planning to flee the country. The fictional financial desperation was designed to push Jennifer and Rhett into making their move before they were fully prepared. The psychological pressure was having the desired effect. Jennifer began making mistakes, growing careless in her communications with Rhett and her other accomplices. She started leaving incriminating evidence where Malcolm could find it, apparently too stressed to maintain her previous level of operational security. Malcolm's apparent drinking problem also served another purpose. It gave him an excuse to behave erratically while maintaining perfect clarity. When Jennifer found him passed out his office, surrounded by empty bottles and what appeared to be suicide notes, she had no idea that Malcolm had consumed nothing but colored water and that the suicide notes were carefully crafted evidence for the criminal case he was building. The beauty of Malcolm's strategy was that it used Jennifer's own plans against her. She wanted him to appear unstable and suicidal, so Malcolm gave her exactly what she expected to see. But every piece of evidence Jennifer collected to support her narrative was actually documentation of her own crimes. 3 weeks into the deception, Malcolm received the confirmation he'd been waiting for. Kenneth's surveillance team intercepted communications between Rhett and Dr. Marianne Carrillo, the psychiatrist Jennifer had been using to build her case for Malcolm's mental instability. "The subject is deteriorating faster than anticipated," Dr. Carrillo reported to Rhett. His wife's documentation suggests severe paranoid ideation with suicidal tendencies. "We may need to accelerate the timeline for intervention." Intervention was the code word they'd established for murder. Malcolm felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same focused energy that had carried him through combat operations where failure meant death. Jennifer and her team were preparing to kill him, But they had no idea they were walking into the most elaborate trap Malcolm had ever constructed. The final phase of Malcolm's counter-operation began with a phone call to his cousin Eddie. "I need you to do something that's going to seem very strange," Malcolm said. "Tomorrow, when Jennifer comes to your store, and she will come to your store, I need you to tell her something specific." Eddie listened carefully as Malcolm outlined exactly what needed to be said, when it needed to be said, and how Jennifer would likely respond. "This is about more than the ring, isn't it?" Eddie asked. "The ring was just the opening move," Malcolm replied. "What's coming next is the end game." Jennifer took the bait perfectly. The following day, she visited Eddie's jewelry store with tears in her eyes and a story about Malcolm's deteriorating mental health. She claimed to be concerned about his access to weapons, his threats of self-harm, and his increasingly erratic behavior. Eddie played his role flawlessly, expressing concern and offering to help Jennifer protect Malcolm from himself. By the end of their conversation, Jennifer believed she had an ally within Malcolm's family who would support her version of events when Malcolm was found dead. What Jennifer didn't know was that every word of their conversation was being recorded, adding to the mountain of evidence that would ensure her conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. That evening, Malcolm sat in his real office reviewing the complete intelligence package his team had assembled. Jennifer's conspiracy involved 8 people across multiple states, had been in planning for over 2 years, and included detailed plans for Malcolm's assassination disguised as suicide. But Malcolm had something Jennifer didn't: patience, superior resources, and 2 decades of experience in destroying people who thought they were smarter than him. "Tomorrow we spring the trap," Malcolm told Kenneth. "Make sure everyone is in position." Kenneth nodded. "What about Jennifer? When this is over, she's going to know you played her completely." Malcolm's expression was granite hard. "Jennifer stopped being my wife the moment she decided to have me killed. Tomorrow, she becomes just another enemy who chose the wrong target." Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The setup was perfect. Malcolm had arranged for Jennifer to believe he would be alone in the house on Friday evening, depressed and heavily intoxicated, with easy access to the gun safe she'd been photographing for months. Her sister Leslie had provided information about Malcolm's bank accounts being frozen due to suspicious activity, adding to the narrative of financial ruin. Dr. Marianne Carrillo had filed a report suggesting Malcolm was an immediate danger to himself. From Jennifer's perspective, all the pieces were in place for Malcolm's suicide to appear inevitable and well-documented. Malcolm spent Friday afternoon carefully staging the scene. Empty liquor bottles were placed strategically around his home office. Financial documents showing devastating losses were left open on his desk. A loaded pistol was positioned in the gun safe with the combination Jennifer knew. Even his computer was prepared with what appeared to be a final suicide note, timed to be automatically saved at 9:47 p.m. But Malcolm wasn't in the house. He was 3 blocks away in a surveillance van, watching through hidden cameras as Jennifer and Rhett prepared to murder him. Kenneth sat beside Malcolm, monitoring communications intercepts from the entire conspiracy network. "They're moving into position now. Jennifer just texted Rhett that you're completely gone and won't wake up even if someone shakes you." Through the high-definition cameras Malcolm had installed throughout his home, they watched Jennifer enter the house at 9:15 p.m. using her key. She moved carefully through the downstairs rooms, confirming that Malcolm appeared to be passed out drunk in his office chair. Rhett entered through the back door 10 minutes later, carrying a medical bag provided by their accomplice, Nurse Ada Gentry. The plan was simple: inject Malcolm with a paralytic agent that would leave him conscious but unable to move, then stage his suicide using his own weapon. The paralytic would be undetectable in routine toxicology screening, and Malcolm's apparent financial ruin, combined with Dr. Carrillo's psychiatric evaluations, would provide a convincing motive. "He's really out," Jennifer whispered to Rhett as they stood over the dummy Malcolm had positioned in his chair, a mannequin dressed in his clothes and positioned to appear unconscious. "Perfect," Rhett replied, opening the medical bag. "Ada says this stuff works in 30 seconds. He'll be aware of everything, but completely paralyzed. We can take our time setting up the scene." Malcolm felt a cold satisfaction as he watched his would-be killers prepare to murder what they thought was his unconscious body. Every word they spoke was being recorded in high-definition audio and video. Every action they took was documented by multiple camera angles. Rhett prepared the syringe with practiced efficiency, confirming that this wasn't his first experience with pharmaceutical murder. Once he's paralyzed, we put the gun in his hand and pull the trigger. The residue will be on his fingers. The angle will be consistent with suicide, and everyone will think he finally snapped under the pressure. What about the insurance investigation? Jennifer asked. Covered. Carrillo's psychiatric evaluation makes suicide the obvious conclusion. Your sister confirmed all the financial problems. Even his own cousin thinks he's been acting unstable. Rhett smiled as he approached the dummy. This is going to be the perfect crime. Malcolm keyed his radio. All units. Target is preparing to administer fatal injection. Move in 60 seconds. But Malcolm wasn't finished with his performance. He waited until Rhett actually pressed the syringe against the dummy's neck before triggering the final phase of his trap. The lights in the house suddenly blazed to full brightness. The dummy collapsed forward, revealing the recording equipment that had been hidden behind it. And Malcolm's voice echoed through hidden speakers throughout the house. Thank you for the confession, idiots. The front and back doors exploded inward simultaneously as FBI agents flooded into the house. Jennifer screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Rhett dropped the syringe and raised his hands, his face white with the realization of how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. Jennifer Lyons and Rhett Greenbaum, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, the lead FBI agent announced as tactical teams secured both suspects. Malcolm entered his own house for the first time in hours, flanked by FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had been watching the operation from the surveillance van. The look on Jennifer's face when she saw him, alive, alert, and completely in control, was worth every moment of the elaborate deception. You're supposed to be unconscious, Jennifer stammered. I'm supposed to be dead, Malcolm corrected. That was your plan, wasn't it? Murder me, take my money, and disappear with your boyfriend? Jennifer's expression cycled through shock, denial, and finally resignation as she realized the scope of Malcolm's counter-operation. You knew everything. I know about the paralytic drugs. I know about the psychiatric evaluations. I know about your sister feeding information from a bank. I know about your friend at the DMV providing false identifications. I know about every person you involved in your little conspiracy. Malcolm's voice was calm, professional. What I don't know is whether you actually thought you were smart enough to murder a man who's been killing people professionally for 20 years. The FBI agents led Jennifer and Rhett away in handcuffs, but Malcolm's work was far from finished. The conspiracy had involved 8 people across 3 states, and Malcolm intended to see every single one of them face consequences for their betrayal. Kenneth approached with a satisfied expression. The simultaneous arrests are happening now. Leslie Frazier at the bank, Dr. Carrillo at her office, Ada Gentry at the hospital, Tracy Eaton at the DMV. Even Octavio Decker is being arrested for industrial espionage. Malcolm nodded. What about the evidence? 27 hours of recorded conversations, detailed financial records of the theft, documented proof of the conspiracy to commit murder, and testimony from every person they tried to involve. Kenneth smiled. The prosecutors are calling it the most well-documented criminal conspiracy they've ever seen. Malcolm walked through his house, surveying the scene where Jennifer and Rhett had intended to stage his suicide. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had destroyed themselves in the exact location where they'd planned to destroy him. There's one more thing, Kenneth said. Jennifer's first husband, David Wilcox? The FBI reopened that case based on the evidence we provided. Looks like this won't be the first murder charge she faces. Malcolm felt no satisfaction from that revelation, only the cold certainty that justice would be thorough and complete. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed him. She'd been a predator for years, and Malcolm had finally ended her hunting season permanently. As the FBI crime scene teams processed evidence throughout the house, Malcolm stood in his office looking at the engagement ring that had started everything. The engraving still read, Thanks for the evidence, idiot. But now it had become prophetic rather than sarcastic. Jennifer had provided him with all the evidence he needed to destroy her completely. Chapter 7. The Reckoning begins. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had seen many high-profile cases, but the conspiracy trial of Jennifer Lyons and her accomplices drew unusual attention from both media and law enforcement professionals. Malcolm sat in the gallery each day, watching as the prosecution methodically dismantled the lives of everyone who had betrayed him. Jennifer looked different in her orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of evidence that surrounded her like a net. The woman who had once thought herself clever enough to murder a professional killer now sat silently as federal prosecutors presented 27 hours of recorded conversations documenting her crimes. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Herman Walton, had built his reputation on complex conspiracy cases, but even he was impressed by the thoroughness of Malcolm's documentation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walton began his opening statement. You are about to hear the defendants describe, in their own words, how they planned to murder Malcolm Lyons, steal his assets, and escape justice. These aren't allegations or interpretations. These are their actual voices, recorded as they prepared to commit cold-blooded murder. The first recording played was devastating. Jennifer's voice filled the courtroom as she explained to Rhett how the paralytic drug would leave Malcolm conscious, but helpless as they staged his suicide. Several jurors visibly recoiled as they heard her describe Malcolm as the perfect victim because his military background would make suicide seem plausible. Malcolm watched Jennifer's face as her own words condemned her. She kept glancing toward him, as if expecting some sign of the man she'd once manipulated, but Malcolm's expression remained impassive. She was no longer his wife. She was simply another criminal facing the consequences of choosing the wrong target. Rhett's attorney attempted a defense based on Jennifer's manipulation, claiming his client was merely a pawn in her elaborate scheme. The strategy collapsed when prosecutors played recordings of Rhett describing his previous projects, the 3 wealthy women who had died under suspicious circumstances, generating insurance payouts that funded his lifestyle. My client was clearly the mastermind of this operation, Rhett's attorney argued desperately, pointing at Jennifer. She recruited him specifically because of his experience with these types of situations. The admission that Rhett had experience with murdering wealthy women destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for him. Dr. Marianne Carrillo's testimony was particularly damning. The psychiatrist had been creating false documentation of Malcolm's mental state, building a paper trail that would support the suicide narrative after his murder. But under cross-examination, her carefully constructed lies fell apart. You never actually met with Malcolm Lyons, did you, Doctor? Prosecutor Walton asked. No, but Mrs. Lyons provided detailed reports of his behavior. Reports that you now know were fabricated to support a murder plot. Dr. Carrillo's silence spoke volumes. The financial evidence was equally devastating. Leslie Frazier, Jennifer's sister, had provided confidential bank information that enabled the systematic theft of nearly $300,000 from Malcolm's accounts. The paper trail was so complete that Leslie's attorney advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial. My client was manipulated by her sister, Leslie's attorney explained to reporters. She had no idea the information was being used to plan a murder. Malcolm knew better. The recorded conversations proved that Leslie was fully aware of the conspiracy and had been promised a substantial cut of the insurance money after Malcolm's death. But the most shocking revelation came when prosecutors introduced evidence about Jennifer's first husband, David Wilcox. Based on Malcolm's intelligence gathering, the FBI had reopened the 3-year-old case and discovered that David's death followed the exact same pattern as the planned murder of Malcolm. Jennifer Lyons has done this before, Prosecutor Walton told the jury. David Wilcox was slowly poisoned over several months, made to appear mentally unstable, and then died under circumstances that were initially ruled accidental. The insurance payout was $750,000, which Jennifer used to reinvent herself and target her next victim. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that defense attorneys began negotiating plea bargains by the third day of trial. Idi0t, the nurse who had provided the paralytic drugs, agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. Idi0t, who had created false identification documents, provided details about Rhett's previous crimes to secure her own plea deal. One by one, Jennifer's co-conspirators abandoned her in hopes of reducing their own punishment. The loyalty she had counted on evaporated as each accomplice chose self-preservation over solidarity. Malcolm felt no surprise at their betrayals. Criminals always turned on each other when facing serious consequences. What satisfied him was the thoroughness of the collapse. Jennifer's carefully constructed network was destroying itself exactly as Malcolm had predicted. On the fourth day of trial, Octavio Decker took the stand as a prosecution witness. Malcolm's business rival had been arrested for industrial espionage, but negotiated a cooperation agreement to avoid federal charges. Rhett Greenbaum approached me approximately 8 months ago, Decker testified. He claimed to have access to inside information about Malcolm Lyons' security contracts and offered to sell me client lists, operational procedures, and bid specifications. "Did you pay for this information?" Prosecutor Walton asked. "Yes. Over the course of several months, I paid approximately $150,000 for what I believed was legitimately obtained competitive intelligence." "When did you realize the information was being stolen?" Decker's expression was uncomfortable. "When the FBI explained that Greenbaum was obtaining the information as part of a conspiracy to murder Mr. Lyons. I had no knowledge of any murder plot." Malcolm doubted Decker's claims of innocence, but it didn't matter. Decker's business was ruined, his reputation destroyed, and his client base had fled to competitors who weren't associated with murder conspiracies. Justice didn't always require prison sentences. Sometimes complete professional destruction was sufficient punishment. As the trial progressed, Malcolm began to appreciate the poetry of Jennifer's situation. She had spent months planning his psychological destruction, creating documentation of his supposed mental instability and financial ruin. Now she sat in a courtroom listening to her own recorded voice describe her crimes while her life collapsed in exactly the way she had intended his to collapse. The difference was that Malcolm's apparent destruction had been a carefully orchestrated performance, while Jennifer's destruction was absolutely real and utterly permanent. On the fifth day of trial, Jennifer's attorney made a desperate motion for a mistrial, claiming that Malcolm had entrapped his clients. The judge's response was swift and decisive. Mr. Lyons did not encourage, solicit, or facilitate any criminal activity, Judge Malcolm Lyons ruled. He simply documented crimes that were already in progress and allowed the defendants to reveal their intentions through their own actions and words. Motion denied. The trial was nearing its conclusion, but Malcolm knew the real punishment was just beginning. Prison sentences were only the first phase of consequences that would follow Jennifer and her accomplices for the rest of their lives. As Malcolm left the courthouse that evening, he reflected on how completely Jennifer had misunderstood the man she had tried to destroy. She had seen his success and assumed he was soft, seen his apparent love for her and assumed he was weak, seen his legitimate business and assumed he had forgotten the harder skills that had built his reputation. Jennifer had been wrong about everything, and tomorrow the jury would begin deliberations that would seal her fate permanently. Chapter 8. No Mercy, No Forgiveness. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. Malcolm sat in the courtroom gallery, watching as Jennifer heard the words that would define the rest of her life. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of wire fraud, guilty of identity theft, guilty of racketeering. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was a masterclass in judicial thoroughness. Judge Ian Knapp had reviewed every piece of evidence, every recorded conversation, every document in the case that prosecutors were calling the most comprehensively documented conspiracy in federal court history. "Mrs. Lyons," Judge Knapp addressed Jennifer directly, The evidence presented in this case reveals a level of premeditation, manipulation, and callous disregard for human life that this court finds particularly disturbing. You didn't simply plan to murder your husband. You systematically destroyed his reputation, stole his assets, and recruited multiple accomplices to facilitate what you intended to be the perfect crime. Jennifer stood silently as the judge continued. Malcolm noted that she had lost considerable weight during her months in federal custody, and her once carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated. She looked like what she had always been beneath the surface, a predator who had finally been caught. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the conspiracy to commit murder charge, plus 25 years for the financial crimes, to be served consecutively. Additionally, you will make full restitution to your victims and forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity. Life without parole. Malcolm felt a cold satisfaction as the words echoed through the courtroom. Jennifer would die in prison, exactly as she had intended Malcolm to die in his home. Rhett Greenbaum received an identical sentence after prosecutors proved he had murdered at least 2 of his previous girlfriends, using methods nearly identical to those planned for Malcolm. The serial killer who had thought himself untouchable would spend the rest of his life in a 6x8 cell. Dr. Marianne Carrillo received 15 years for her role in creating false psychiatric evaluations to support the murder plot. Her medical license was permanently revoked, and she faced additional civil lawsuits from families of other patients whose records she had falsified over the years. Leslie Frazier, Jennifer's sister, received 12 years and permanent banishment from the banking industry. The sister who had betrayed family loyalty for money would serve her sentence in the same federal facility as Jennifer, a detail that Malcolm found appropriately ironic. The remaining conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, with permanent restrictions on their professional activities and complete forfeiture of any assets connected to their crimes. But Malcolm's revenge extended far beyond the courtroom. Using the same methodical approach that had documented their crimes, Malcolm had systematically destroyed every aspect of their lives that prison sentences couldn't touch. Jennifer's extended family discovered her true nature through carefully leaked evidence of her previous husband's murder. Her parents, who had initially offered to support her defense, publicly disowned her after learning she had been a serial killer. Her few remaining friends abandoned her when they realized their association with Jennifer made them suspects in other unsolved deaths. Malcolm ensured that Jennifer entered prison with no allies, no support system, and no hope of sympathy from anyone who knew her story. She would serve her life sentence in complete isolation, abandoned by everyone she had once manipulated. Rhett's fate was even more complete. Malcolm's investigation had uncovered evidence linking him to 5 additional suspicious deaths across 3 states. By the time all charges were filed, Rhett faced multiple life sentences and the virtual certainty that he would die in prison regardless of any potential appeals. The civil lawsuits were equally devastating. Malcolm's legal team had filed comprehensive claims against every conspirator, seeking damages for theft, emotional distress, damage to reputation, and attempted murder. The financial judgments would ensure that any assets the criminals had hidden would eventually be seized and forfeited. But Malcolm's most satisfying revenge was reserved for those who had betrayed family loyalty. His cousin Eddie had remained completely loyal throughout the entire ordeal, never wavering in his support despite Jennifer's attempts to manipulate him. Eddie's jewelry store now displayed a small plaque in the window. "Thanks for the evidence," a private joke that reminded Malcolm daily of how perfectly his plan had succeeded. 6 months after the sentencing, Malcolm stood in his renovated home office, the same room where Jennifer and Rhett had planned to stage a suicide. The space had been completely remodeled, with no trace remaining of the elaborate trap that had destroyed his enemies. Kenneth Berry knocked and entered, carrying the final report on the conspiracy's aftermath. "All assets have been seized and liquidated," Kenneth reported. "Between the restitution payments and civil judgments, you've recovered everything they stole plus punitive damages. The total comes to just over $2.3 million. Malcolm nodded. The money had never been the primary objective. Complete destruction of his enemies had been the goal, and that goal had been achieved beyond his most optimistic projections. What about the business impact? Malcolm asked. Better than expected. Once the details of the conspiracy became public, your reputation actually improved. Potential clients are impressed that you uncovered and defeated such an elaborate plot. We've gained 6 new contracts in the past 3 months, all specifically requesting the same level of strategic protection you used against Jennifer. Malcolm smiled. Jennifer's attempt to destroy his business had ultimately made him more successful. Clients now understood that Malcolm Lyons wasn't just a security consultant. He was someone who could identify threats before they became dangerous and neutralize enemies so completely that they would never pose a risk again. The final piece of intelligence concerned Jennifer's current situation in federal prison. She had been placed in protective custody after other inmates learned about her crimes against a military veteran. Even in prison, Jennifer was isolated and vulnerable, exactly as Malcolm had intended. Any word from her attorney about appeals? Malcolm asked. Her original attorney withdrew from the case. She can't afford to pay for appeals, and no competent lawyer wants to be associated with a case that's considered legally perfect. The conviction will stand. Malcolm walked to the window overlooking his property, the same view he had enjoyed before Jennifer entered his life with her carefully planned deception. Everything was as it should be, better, actually, because now he knew exactly what threats looked like and how to eliminate them permanently. The engagement ring that had started everything sat in a place of honor on Malcolm's desk, its engraving still clearly visible. Thanks for the evidence, idiot. It served as a daily reminder that betrayal had consequences and that some people were simply too dangerous to leave alive in society. Malcolm had no regrets about the destruction he had brought down on Jennifer and her accomplices. They had chosen to declare war on him, and Malcolm had responded with the overwhelming force that such a declaration required. In Malcolm's world, there was no forgiveness for betrayal, no mercy for those who chose him as their target, and no second chances for people who tried to destroy everything he had built. Jennifer had learned that lesson too late to save herself, but perfectly in time to serve as an example for anyone else who might consider Malcolm Lyons an easy target. Chapter 9. The Price of Betrayal. 2 years after the trial, Malcolm sat in his expanded office overlooking downtown Chicago, reviewing quarterly reports that showed his security consulting firm had tripled in size. The attempted murder had become the ultimate testimonial for his services. If Malcolm Lyons could identify and destroy a conspiracy that included his own wife, what chance did his client's enemies have? The intercom buzzed. Mr. Lyons, your cousin Eddie is here to see you. Eddie entered carrying a small velvet box, his expression more serious than usual. Thought you'd want to see this, he said, placing the box on Malcolm's desk. Inside was the engagement ring. The same ring Jennifer had bought for Rhett using Malcolm's credit card. The same ring that had triggered the investigation that destroyed them all. But now it had been reset, the diamond removed, and placed in a different setting entirely. What am I looking at? Malcolm asked. Anniversary gift for my wife, Eddie explained. 25 years next month. I had the stone reset, but I kept the original engraving. Figured it belonged in the family. Malcolm examined the new setting. The engraving was still clearly visible. Thank for the evidence, idiot. It had become a family motto, a reminder of what happened when someone tried to betray a Lyons. Any word from federal prison? Eddie asked casually. Malcolm's expression didn't change. Jennifer died 3 months ago. Apparently, she was found in her cell with a note saying she couldn't live with what she'd done. The warden ruled it's suicide. Eddie nodded slowly. Both men understood that Jennifer's death wasn't entirely surprising. Life in federal prison for someone convicted of attempting to murder a military veteran was never going to be easy or long. And Rhett, still alive, still in solitary confinement. He's filed 17 appeals, all rejected. The pattern of murders across multiple states means he'll never see daylight again. Malcolm's voice carried no emotion. He gets to live with the knowledge that his perfect crime turned into perfect evidence of his guilt. Kenneth Barry knocked and entered with a thick folder. Final update on the remaining conspirators, he announced. The report made for satisfying reading. Dr. Marianne Carrillo had been stabbed by another inmate who disapproved of her crimes against veterans. She survived, but would require extensive medical care for the rest of her sentence. Leslie Frazier had been transferred to 3 different facilities after repeated conflicts with other inmates who learned about her role in the conspiracy. The others? Malcolm asked. Idi0t lost her nursing license and is working in the prison laundry. Tracy Eaton is in minimum security, but her parole was denied last month. None of them have any prospect of rebuilding their lives after release. Malcolm felt no satisfaction from their suffering, only the cold certainty that justice had been thorough and complete. These people had chosen to participate in his attempted murder, and they were experiencing the natural consequences of that choice. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Malcolm's assistant announced that his attorney was on the phone with urgent news. Mr. Lyons, the attorney's voice was excited. I have news about the Wilcox case. David Wilcox's family just won a $50 million wrongful death judgment against Jennifer's estate. With her death, they're now entitled to seize all remaining assets, including anything she might have hidden offshore. Malcolm smiled. Jennifer's first victim was getting justice even after her death. The family she had destroyed by murdering their son would recover at least some compensation, and any money Jennifer had stolen would be returned to its rightful owners. There's more, the attorney continued. The FBI has linked Rhett to 2 additional murders in Florida and Nevada. Both cases are being reopened with new evidence from your investigation. He's looking at 3 more life sentences. Malcolm ended the call and turned back to Eddie and Kenneth. Justice has a way of being thorough when you give it enough evidence to work with. Eddie stood to leave, but paused at the door. You know, I never asked you this before, but did you ever actually love her? Jennifer, I mean. Malcolm considered the question carefully. I loved who I thought she was. The woman I married never existed. She was a character Jennifer created to manipulate me. When I discovered the truth, that love died instantly and completely. No regrets about how it ended? Malcolm's expression was granite hard. My only regret is that I didn't identify the threat sooner. If I had been more careful in my background investigation before marrying her, David Wilcox might still be alive. Eddie nodded and left, understanding that some conversations were finished forever. Kenneth remained, reviewing the final details of cases that had grown out of Malcolm's original investigation. The ripple effects are still spreading. 3 other suspicious deaths in different states are being investigated based on patterns we identified. Jennifer and Rhett weren't just planning to kill you. They've been doing this for years. Malcolm walked to his office window, looking out over the city where he had built his empire and defended it against those who thought they could take it from him. 2 years ago, Jennifer had been planning his death in this very building. Now she was dead. Her accomplices were in prison, and Malcolm's business was more successful than ever. The lesson was simple and brutal. Betrayal had consequences, and those consequences were permanent. Malcolm opened his desk drawer and withdrew a new business card he'd had printed. Below his name and contact information was a simple motto: some mistakes you only make once. It was a warning to potential enemies and a promise to potential clients. Malcolm Lyons didn't just solve security problems. He eliminated them so completely that they could never threaten his clients again. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Another potential client, another threat to be assessed and neutralized, another opportunity to demonstrate why choosing Malcolm Lyons as an enemy was the last mistake someone would ever make. As Malcolm reached for the phone, he glanced one final time at the engagement ring Eddie had left behind. The engraving still caught the light. Thanks for the evidence, Idi0t. Jennifer had given him everything he needed to destroy her completely. She had documented her own crimes, recorded her own confessions, and recruited the very people who would testify against her. In trying to destroy Malcolm Lyons, Jennifer had succeeded only in destroying herself and everyone foolish enough to trust her. Malcolm smiled as he answered the phone. Lyons Security Consulting. Some problems require permanent solutions. The war was over. Malcolm had won completely, and he would never, ever forgive. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.